The room was already on its feet when the doors closed behind them. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above a ballroom dressed in ivory and gold, their light catching on polished shoes, cufflinks, silk dresses, and the soft gleam of champagne flutes lifted in applause. The annual leadership gala had always been elegant, always carefully curated, but tonight carried an extra sense of importance. This was her night. Maribel Ashcroft's night. Months of planning had led to this moment, and every detail confirmed it. Callan Whitmore sat in the front row, his posture straight, shoulders squared, hands loosely clasped over one knee. He wore the calm expression expected of a man in his position, a CEO accustomed to rooms like this, to admiration delivered in measured claps and approving nods. The tailored suit fit him perfectly, dark and understated, chosen not to draw attention away from the woman beside him. Maribel leaned in slightly, her smile graceful, effortless. She looked exactly as everyone expected her to look, refined, composed, luminous in a floor-length dress that caught the light without demanding it. Her hand rested lightly on his forearm, a public signal of partnership, of alignment. The crowd noticed. They always did. To anyone watching, Callan Whitmore looked settled, successful, certain. Inside, he was simply waiting for the program to move forward. The applause rose again as the host returned to the podium, a woman known for commanding rooms filled with donors and decision-makers. She waited patiently, one hand lifted in appreciation, until the clapping softened into silence. "Good evening," she began, her voice warm and practiced. "Tonight, we celebrate women who lead not only with vision, but with courage. Women who build, who lift, who create opportunities where none existed before." Maribel's fingers tightened just slightly on Callan's arm. He leaned closer, murmuring something about how proud he was of her. She smiled back, appreciative, confident. This gala was a reflection of her values, her network, her world. Callan scanned the room briefly. Board members from Houston, donors from Dallas, familiar faces from New York and Chicago. He recognized nearly everyone. This was his ecosystem, adjacent to his work, aligned with his life. The host continued. "Our chief guest and keynote speaker tonight embodies that spirit in every sense. She is a founder, a mentor, a leader whose work has changed lives across communities and industries." Callan's gaze drifted toward the stage, attentive but detached. He had reviewed the program weeks ago. Keynote speaker, distinguished, accomplished, another impressive woman whose resume would sound good on paper. Nothing more. The host smiled wider. "Please join in welcoming." She paused, allowing anticipation to bloom across the room. Zanai River. The name did not echo. It landed. Callan's breath caught so sharply, it felt as though the air had been pulled from his chest. His hands, moments ago steady, tightened without instruction. For a fraction of a second, his mind rejected what his ears had just accepted. Zanai Rivers. The applause surged, enthusiastic, genuine. Chairs shifted as guests leaned forward, eager. The name meant something here. It carried weight. Callan did not clap. He could not. His vision narrowed, the edges of the room blurring as the present fractured beneath him. That name, carefully folded away years ago, placed in a mental drawer marked closed, had been spoken aloud in the one place he never expected to hear it. Beside him, Maribel turned slightly. "Isn't she incredible?" she whispered, unaware. "I've wanted her for this event since last year." Callan did not answer. The doors near the stage opened, and Zanai Rivers stepped into view. The applause intensified, but Callan heard it as if from underwater. His heartbeat pressed against his ribs, loud, insistent. She looked older, not aged, but grounded. Her posture was calm, assured, the kind of confidence earned rather than rehearsed. She wore a tailored dress in a deep, rich tone, elegant, without excess. Her hair framed her face naturally, unapologetically her own. She smiled as she approached the podium, acknowledging the crowd with a small nod, not performative, not seeking approval. Callan felt his throat tighten. She had always entered rooms like that, without shrinking, without asking permission. He had not seen her in years. Not in photographs, not in passing, not even in memory. He allowed himself to revisit. Yet there she was, alive, thriving, standing at the center of his present. The host stepped aside, beaming. Zanai placed her notes on the podium, adjusted the microphone slightly, and waited. The applause carried on, some guests rising again in appreciation. It was clear she was admired here, celebrated. Callan's chest constricted. This, not a coincidence. This was not a harmless overlap of professional worlds. This was something else entirely, something he had no language for in that moment. He became acutely aware of Maribel beside him, of her warmth, her expectation, the engagement ring in her purse, waiting for its moment later that evening. The life they were building, cleanly outlined, socially affirmed. Now, this. Zanai lifted her gaze, scanning the room with a familiarity that unsettled him. Her eyes passed over donors, colleagues, strangers, and then, briefly, unmistakably, they found him. There was no visible reaction, no widened eyes, no falter, only recognition. Callan felt the impact of it like a physical blow. The past did not rush in dramatically. It pressed itself into his chest, heavy, undeniable. Conversations he had buried. A voice he had not heard in years. A version of himself he had convinced himself no longer existed. Maribel leaned closer again. "You okay?" she whispered, her tone gentle. He nodded automatically, the movement shallow. His jaw tightened. Zanai began to speak. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady, resonant. "Thank you for having me." The room quieted, attentive. Every eye turned forward. Callan stared at the stage, unable to look away. Each word anchored him further into a moment he had not prepared for. Her voice carried the same clarity he remembered, direct, thoughtful, unembellished. He swallowed hard. This was happening, in front of everyone, in the one place he had always felt most in control. He glanced down at his hands. They were shaking. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for him. The applause had faded. The room belonged to her now. And Callan Whitmore, CEO, fiancé, carefully composed architect of his own life, sat frozen in the front row, confronted by a name, a woman, and a history that refused to stay silent. Before the weight of the moment could settle any deeper, the narrator's voice cuts in softly, deliberately, addressing the viewer directly. Before we go any further, take a second to like this video if you enjoy powerful American love stories, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Zanai's voice settled into the room with ease, not loud, not restrained, clear. The kind of clarity that asked people to listen rather than demanding it. "Thank you," she said again, her eyes sweeping the audience with a composed warmth. "It's an honor to be here tonight, among so many people committed to building something meaningful." Heads nodded. Pens hovered over programs. Phones were lowered, forgotten. The room leaned in. Callan remained rigid, his spine straight against the chair, every sense sharpened. He told himself to focus on the speech, on the cadence, on anything that might pull his thoughts out of the past. He failed almost immediately. Zanai spoke about leadership, not as a title, but as a practice. She talked about creating space where others could grow, about lifting people whose potential was often dismissed before it had a chance to be seen. Her words carried experience. They were not aspirational slogans. They were lived truths. "When I started my work," she continued, "I didn't have access to the rooms where decisions were made. I had kitchens, community centers, borrowed offices. What I did have was responsibility, to show up, to keep going, to make sure the women who trusted me were never invisible." The crowd responded softly at first. Murmurs of agreement, scattered applause. Callan felt the pull of familiarity in her phrasing. She was speaking the same way she always had, grounded, precise, unafraid to acknowledge effort without glorifying struggle. Maribel sat forward, clearly impressed. Callan noticed how easily Zanai commanded respect here, how naturally she belonged on that stage. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. Zanai shifted, resting her hands lightly on the edges of the podium. "Leadership," she said, "also means acknowledging the parts of our lives that don't fit neatly into professional bios." A ripple moved through the room. "For me," she continued, "that includes motherhood." The response was immediate and warm. Smiles spread. Several women exchanged knowing looks. Applause rose again. Fuller this time. Callan's chest tightened. Zanai spoke about balance without pretending it was easy. She spoke about mornings that began before sunrise, about decisions made with someone else's future in mind, about the discipline it took to keep promises to others and to herself. "And I learned something important," she said, her tone thoughtful. "You can build something strong with limited support. You can lead while carrying responsibility others never see. And you don't have to hide the parts of your life that made you who you are." Callan's breath shortened. He felt heat rise beneath his collar, a familiar pressure gathering behind his eyes. He shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his cufflinks. Anything to steady himself. Then it happened. At first, it was barely noticeable. A small movement near the side of the stage. A few people in the front rows glanced sideways, distracted. A whisper of motion cut through the stillness. A small boy had appeared. He couldn't have been more than 5. He wore a neatly pressed outfit that suggested someone had dressed him carefully that evening. Though one shoe strap had already come loose, he looked curious, unbothered by the size of the room or the number of eyes on him. He walked with the easy confidence of a child who knew exactly where he wanted to be. Zanai noticed him mid-sentence. Her expression softened instantly. Not performative, not surprised. She paused, her voice trailing off naturally, and stepped slightly away from the podium. The boy crossed the short distance to her and wrapped one arm around her leg, pressing his cheek against her knee. The gesture was instinctive, uncalculated. He looked up at her with complete trust. The room reacted as one. A collective exhale. Laughter softened into smiles. A few quiet ohs floated through the air. Phones reappeared, not for status updates, but to capture a moment that felt genuine, human. Zanai rested her hand gently on the boy's head. "Looks like my timing needs work," she said, with a small smile. The audience laughed, warmly, generously. The tension dissolved, replaced by affection. Callan did not hear the laughter. He was staring at the child, not because a child had walked onto the stage, because of the boy's face, the shape of his eyes, the angle of his brow, the way his lashes cast a shadow when he blinked. Callan's breath stalled, his lungs refusing to cooperate. His hands went cold. No, that wasn't. His heart began to pound, heavy and irregular. He leaned forward without realizing it, his focus narrowing to the small figure clinging to Zanai. The boy turned his head slightly, scanning the room with mild curiosity, and Callan saw it fully. The resemblance was exact, not symbolic, not suggestive, precise. The room tilted. Callan's fingers curled into the fabric of his trousers, knuckles whitening. His jaw tightened until it ached. A sharp ringing filled his ears, drowning out the gentle applause that followed as Zanai guided the child a step back. She spoke calmly, reassuring him. "Go sit with Ms. Renee, okay? I'll be right there." The boy nodded, obedient, glancing once more toward the audience before trotting off to the side, where a woman waited with open arms. The moment passed for everyone else. For Callan, it split something open. His chest felt too tight, as if the air had thickened. He swallowed, unsuccessfully. His pulse hammered at his temples. A faint tremor ran through his hands, then his arms. He had seen his own reflection countless times, in mirrors, in photographs, in boardroom windows. He knew his face. He had just seen it again, on a stage, in child, in a life he had never known existed. Maribel touched his arm. "That was sweet," she whispered. "She really balances it all, doesn't she?" Callan did not answer. His gaze remained locked forward, but his focus had turned inward, collapsing under the weight of recognition. Questions surged without forming words. Time lines, memories, a silence that suddenly felt enormous. Zanai returned to the podium, her composure intact. As I was saying, she continued, unfazed, our lives don't pause so we can lead. They move alongside us. The crowd applauded again, louder this time, emotionally invested. Callan barely registered it. His breath came shallow, controlled only by force of will. He pressed his tongue against the roof of his mouth, grounding himself, trying not to draw attention. The gala had not slowed. The program had not shifted. Yet his internal world had fractured beyond recognition. Every carefully arranged certainty wavered. He replayed the last time he had seen Zanai, the quiet ending, the unresolved conversations. He thought of the months that followed, the way life had filled the space left behind. He had assumed the story was finished. He had been wrong. The boy had his eyes, not as an echo, as a fact. Zanai concluded her point with grace, drawing the audience back into the rhythm of her message. She spoke of legacy, not what we leave behind, but what we choose to show up for. Callan felt something collapse inward. Legacy. The word struck with unexpected force. The applause rose again as she finished that section of her speech. People smiled, inspired, unaware that the man seated in the front row was holding himself together through sheer discipline. His heartbeat refused to settle. The room had melted into warmth and admiration. Callan Whitmore sat at the center of it, quietly unraveling, without movement, without sound, his composure intact, his future suddenly uncertain. Time seemed to pause, not for the room, but for the story itself. Zanai's voice continued at the podium, steady and composed, carrying across the ballroom as if nothing unusual had occurred. The audience listened, engaged, inspired. Servers moved quietly along the edges. Glasses clinked softly. The gala flowed forward, elegant and intact. Yet the moment had already shifted. For Callan, the world had narrowed to a single point in time, an invisible line drawn between what he believed his life was and what it had just revealed itself to be. The applause faded into background noise. The chandeliers blurred. Even Maribel's presence beside him felt distant, like a memory viewed through glass. And that is where the story asks you to pause. Because what you are witnessing is not simply a coincidence at a gala. It is not just an awkward reunion or a surprising guest reveal. It is the collision of choices made quietly years ago with a present that no longer agrees to stay contained. So let us stop the clock here, right before everything changes again. Right before questions are asked that cannot be avoided. Right before truth demands space. The narrator steps back, gently but firmly, inviting the audience to move with intention. This moment did not begin tonight. It began years earlier, long before tailored suits and donor lists, before this ballroom, before applause ever rose for Zanai Rivers or certainty settled around Callan Whitmore's name. Because what just happened on that stage was not planned, not staged, not designed for effect. It was the past stepping forward without permission. A name spoken aloud. A child seen clearly. A life intersecting another in a room built on control. Callan Whitmore had spent his adult life mastering environments like this one, spaces where everything had an order, where reputation mattered, where surprises were rare and manageable. He believed, like many powerful people do, that what was handled privately stayed there. That belief had just been challenged. In a single glance, the structure he relied on cracked, not dramatically, not outwardly, but in a way far more dangerous, internally. Because when certainty collapses quietly, there is nowhere to hide from it. This is where the story widens. Because Callan and Zanai did not come from the same rooms, even when they once shared the same conversations. Their lives were shaped by different expectations, different rules, different consequences for silence and for truth. Callan was raised in a world where success came with insulation, where discomfort could be managed, where image often carried more weight than explanation. Zanai was raised in a world where presence mattered more than polish, where responsibility was shared openly, where children were not hidden away from ambition but folded into it. When these worlds touched years ago, they did so carefully, with curiosity and affection, but also with fear, neither fully named. Many people watching this story will recognize that tension, the moment when love feels real but inconvenient, the moment when truth feels risky, the moment when silence feels easier than honesty. Power does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like the ability to delay, to defer, to assume there will be time later. Tonight proves that later always arrives. At the heart of this story is something painfully familiar. The feeling of showing up fully and being asked, quietly or directly, to soften, to shrink, to wait. The feeling of speaking clearly and not knowing if you are being heard. The feeling of carrying responsibility alone because explaining it would cost too much. Zanai Rivers knows that feeling. She learned early how to stand steady, even when recognition lagged behind effort. She built her life without expecting permission, without waiting for validation from rooms that were never designed with her in mind. Callan Whitmore knows a different version of invisibility, the kind that comes from being seen only for what you represent, not for what you avoid, the kind that allows mistakes to be buried rather than addressed. Both of them believed the past had resolved itself. Both of them were wrong. Here is the question that matters now. What happens when the truth arrives in a place built on appearances? What happens when responsibility shows up without warning? What happens when love, once delayed by fear, demands accountability instead of comfort? Stay with this story, not to watch a scandal unfold, but to witness what happens when silence is replaced with choice. Because in the chapters ahead, you will see how one night forces every character to confront who they have been and who they are willing to become. You will see how integrity costs more than reputation, how presence outweighs power, and how love, when earned honestly, changes more than any title ever could. This, not the end of the moment you just witnessed. It is the beginning of understanding it. And as the camera pulls back from the gala, away from the applause and the polished surfaces, The story prepares to return to its true starting point, years earlier, where two lives met before either of them knew what would be required to stand fully in the truth. Long before Callan Whitmore learned how to command a room, he learned how to sit inside one, still, observant, controlled. He was raised in spaces where noise was discouraged, not because silence was sacred, but because silence signaled discipline. Private schools taught him this early. Brick buildings with manicured lawns, iron gates that separated inside from everything else, and hallways where history was displayed on polished plaques bearing familiar surnames, some of which matched the names on his family tree. Whitmore. That name opened doors without knocking. Teachers expected excellence before he proved it. Administrators spoke to him with a subtle assurance that he would succeed, not if, but when. Failure, when it happened, was framed as temporary misalignment rather than a reflection of character. From the beginning, Callan understood that privilege didn't announce itself loudly. It worked best when it stayed calm. His parents reinforced this lesson at home. Dinner conversations revolved around preparation, positioning, and restraint. His father spoke often about legacy, not in sentimental terms, but in practical ones. Where you studied, who you knew, how you presented yourself when the stakes were high. Emotion, while not forbidden, was managed. Displayed too openly, it suggested instability. Questions were welcomed, but only after research. Opinions were valued, but only if supported by logic. Love, too, followed a structure. Callan learned early that affection did not exist in isolation. It intersected with reputation, timing, and suitability. Relationships were discussed the same way internships were, evaluated for long-term benefit, alignment, and potential risk. By the time he reached adulthood, these lessons had fused into instinct. College only sharpened them. Elite institutions rewarded his composure. Professors praised his ability to argue without agitation. Peers admired his steadiness, mistaking emotional distance for maturity. He joined clubs that mattered, attended events that positioned him well, and learned how to read rooms before speaking. Callan became fluent in subtle power. Boardrooms later felt familiar, not intimidating. Long tables, neutral tones, measured voices. It was the same language he had spoken his entire life. As his career advanced, first through strategic hires and then through bold but calculated leadership, his confidence grew quietly. When he became CEO of a growing technology logistics firm headquartered in Houston, no one was surprised. He had been moving toward that outcome since adolescence. In meetings, Callan listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, people leaned in. He never raised his voice. He never rushed a decision. His authority came from consistency and the sense that he always knew more than he revealed. This control extended beyond business. Social events followed rules just as precise. Invitations mattered. Seating arrangements carried meaning. Appearances were curated carefully, not to deceive, but to maintain order. Chaos was inefficient. Personal matters were compartmentalized. Grief, when his father passed unexpectedly, tested this discipline. Callan returned to work quickly, too quickly some said. But in his world, productivity was the acceptable face of mourning. He honored his father by preserving momentum, by not letting emotion disrupt the systems they had built. What he did not learn how to do was sit with unresolved feeling. That skill had never been taught. So when Zanai Rivers entered his life years earlier, unfiltered, direct, grounded in a world that valued presence over performance, she disrupted something he didn't know was fragile. She asked questions that had no strategic benefit. She spoke about responsibility in ways that didn't fit spreadsheets or forecasts. He cared for her deeply, more deeply than he had expected to care for anyone. And yet, when pressure mounted, when his mother raised concerns framed as practical, when peers expressed hesitation masked as advice, when introductions became slower, more careful, Callan did what he had always been trained to do. He contained. He delayed. He reassured himself that time would smooth the edges. Then his father died, and structure became refuge. Emotion became risk. Zanai needed presence. Callan retreated into control. By the time he realized what silence had cost him, the relationship had already folded inward. Years later, seated at a gala beside his fiancée, Callan would understand that control only works when the past agrees to stay silent. The past had other plans. Maribel Ashcroft belonged to a lineage that understood influence without ever naming it directly. Her family was known across philanthropic circles, not for excess, but for precision. Their charitable foundations focused on education, women's leadership, and cultural preservation. They attended the right events, funded the right causes, and maintained relationships that spanned generations. Reputation in the Ashcroft household was stewardship. Maribel had been raised to move through elite spaces with ease. She learned early how to host without hovering, how to speak warmly without oversharing, how to dress in ways that signaled status without inviting scrutiny. Her education mirrored Callan's in prestige, if not in temperament. Where Callan was reserved, Maribel was polished. Where he observed, she anticipated. They met through overlapping circles, fundraisers, advisory boards, introductions made with intent. Their first conversations were easy, comfortable. They shared similar references, similar expectations, similar understandings of what life should look like. Their relationship progressed efficiently. There were dinners at carefully chosen restaurants, weekends at properties owned by friends of friends, conversations about future plans that aligned neatly. Maribel admired Callan's discipline. Callan appreciated Maribel's composure. Together, they looked correct. Affection existed, but it was measured. Public gestures were tasteful. Private moments were calm. There were no emotional highs or lows, only stability. To those around them, this was ideal. An engagement, when it came, felt inevitable rather than passionate. The ring itself was chosen with thought. Elegant, understated, worth noticing, but not questioning. It symbolized alignment more than impulse. Maribel believed in partnership as presentation. She took pride in the way they were perceived, in the seamless way their lives fit together. Callan, for his part, respected her clarity. She did not demand what he struggled to give emotionally. She did not challenge his instinct for order. Their bond rested on mutual benefit and shared vision. What it lacked was depth neither of them had named. Callan told himself this was maturity. That intensity faded with age. That love, like business, stabilized over time. He believed that what he felt, calm, appreciation, respect, was enough. Maribel never questioned this framing. She had been taught that compatibility mattered more than volatility. That steadiness was the reward for choosing wisely. So when she planned the gala, celebrating women in leadership, inviting Zanai Rivers as chief guest felt appropriate. Zanai's work aligned with the Foundation's mission. Her reputation was strong. Her story inspiring. There was no awareness of overlap. Maribel had no reason to suspect that the woman she admired professionally carried a history that intersected so deeply with her own future. She saw Zanai as a speaker, a leader, a symbol of the values the evening represented. Callan said nothing. He hadn't known Zanai would be there. And when the name appeared on the program weeks earlier, he hadn't connected it. He had compartmentalized too well for that. But when Zanai stepped onto the stage, when the room responded with warmth and respect, when a child appeared and recognition struck without mercy, the foundation beneath Callan's carefully aligned life shifted. Maribel sensed something that night, not immediately, not clearly, but enough to know that the version of Callan she believed she understood was incomplete. The engagement still existed. The future still looked orderly. But order, once cracked, does not reseal easily. And as applause filled the ballroom, Maribel Ashcroft smiled for the room, unaware that the life she had planned so carefully was standing at the edge of a truth that would demand more than correctness. Zanai Rivers did not grow up in rooms that expected her arrival. She grew up in spaces that adjusted to include her. Her earliest memories were not defined by quiet corridors or carefully guarded conversations, but by sound, voices overlapping, laughter spilling from one room into another, music playing while someone cooked, someone prayed, someone debated. Community was not an idea. It was an environment. Church was one of the first places where she understood this, not because of sermons alone, but because of everything that happened around them. Folding chairs lined up early on Sundays. Children tugged at sleeves while elders exchanged updates that mattered. Who needed help, who had fallen ill, who had landed a new job. Church halls doubled as meeting spaces, planning rooms, and places of celebration. No one was invisible there. If you were absent, someone noticed. If you succeeded, someone announced it. If you struggled, someone showed up. Zanai learned early that strength did not require silence. It required participation. Her family kitchen reinforced that lesson daily. Meals were never rushed. They were shared, discussed, sometimes debated. Generations crossed paths at that table. Grandparents passing down stories, parents offering guidance shaped by experience, cousins learning what accountability looked like in real time. Advice was not whispered privately. It was offered openly, sometimes bluntly, always with the expectation that it would be used. Zanai watched women hold households together while pursuing goals that were rarely applauded publicly. She saw resilience practiced, not praised. Success, when it arrived, belonged to more than one person. That shaped her sense of responsibility. When she excelled in school, it was celebrated collectively. When she stumbled, correction came quickly and without cruelty. No one suggested she dim herself to fit elsewhere. She was taught to stand clearly where she was. Mentorship was woven into daily life, not reserved for formal programs. Older women took notice of her curiosity and confidence. They asked what she planned to do with it. They reminded her that visibility mattered, not for attention, but for access. "Be seen," one of them told her once, "because silence doesn't protect you." That idea stayed with her. As Zanai grew older, she began to recognize how often systems relied on quiet compliance, how frequently opportunity passed over those who waited to be invited. In her world, waiting was not a strategy. Collective success mattered more than individual praise. When someone advanced, they were expected to pull others forward. When someone gained access to a room, they were expected to open the door wider. Zanai internalized this without needing it explained. By the time she entered professional spaces, she carried herself with assurance, not because she believed she was entitled to be there, but because she understood her presence had purpose. She spoke clearly. She asked direct questions. She did not shrink when discomfort followed. Some rooms welcomed that. Others resisted. She learned to tell the difference quickly. When she met Callan Whitmore years earlier, what struck her first was not his status, but his listening. He did not interrupt. He did not dismiss. He engaged thoughtfully, even when her perspective challenged his assumptions. She appreciated that. She did not mistake it for permanence. Their connection grew slowly, built on conversation rather than spectacle. But even then, Zanai noticed the differences between their worlds. The pauses before introductions. The moments when he hesitated, weighing how much of her story belonged in certain rooms. She did not resent it. She observed it. Because where she came from, you learn to read spaces without surrendering yourself to them. That grounding became critical later, when silence arrived unexpectedly, when responsibility landed without warning, when she had to decide how to move forward without answers. Her roots held. Zanai Rivers never waited for permission to begin. Her consulting initiative started modestly, borrowed office space, shared calendars, long evenings spent listening more than advising. She focused on Black women entrepreneurs who had ideas but lacked access, women whose talent was clear, but whose networks were limited by design rather than effort. She did not approach the work as charity. She treated it as investment. Her model centered on practical guidance, how to pitch without apologizing, how to negotiate without shrinking, how to build systems that sustained growth rather than chasing recognition. She connected women to resources. Yes, but more importantly, she connected them to each other. Community scaled when structured intentionally. Her reputation grew steadily, not because she marketed aggressively, but because her results spoke clearly. Women she mentored expanded their businesses. Some failed and tried again, better equipped. Others succeeded and returned as mentors themselves. Zanai made sure the lane she built had room for others to walk alongside her. Speaking engagements followed naturally. Conferences invited her not as a symbol, but as a strategist. Panels valued her clarity. Audiences responded to her ability to name challenges without dramatizing them. She spoke often about leadership shaped by responsibility rather than authority, about building while carrying obligations others did not see, about the discipline required to stay visible when comfort suggested retreat. Motherhood entered her life during this period, not as an interruption, but as an expansion. When she realized she was pregnant, Zanai did not frame the moment as a loss. She framed it as truth. She adjusted her plans, leaned on her support systems, and prepared to carry more than one future at once. She did not hide her child. From the beginning, her son was central to her life, not tucked away for convenience. He attended meetings when necessary, sat quietly during calls, grew accustomed to spaces where adults worked and planned and built. Zanai refused the narrative that leadership and motherhood existed in opposition. She did not pretend balance was effortless. She acknowledged fatigue, constraint, and sacrifice without framing them as defeat. Her son learned early that his presence mattered. When she spoke publicly, she referenced motherhood not as an obstacle, but as perspective. She spoke about accountability that extended beyond personal ambition, about decisions measured not only by outcome, but by example. Audiences listened. Some saw inspiration. Others saw reflection. Many saw permission. By the time she was invited to headline major events, Zanai had already lived the principles she articulated. She stood on stages not to prove worth, but to share process. So when she accepted the invitation to the gala celebrating women in leadership, she approached it as she always did, with intention, preparation, and honesty. She brought her full self. She brought her story. She brought her child. She did not anticipate the collision waiting in the front row, but she did not fear it either, because Zanai Rivers had learned long ago that silence protects nothing worth keeping. And when truth arrived, unexpected, unscheduled, it would find her standing steady, exactly where she belonged. The first time Callan Whitmore saw Zanai Rivers, he was not looking for her. He had arrived late to the Community Innovation Forum, his schedule compressed between board calls and internal strategy sessions. The event was held in a converted civic center on the east side of Houston. Functional, well-lit, modest. It was not the kind of venue he typically associated with professional advancement, which was precisely why he had almost declined the invitation. A diversity advisor from his firm had insisted, not as a request, but as a suggestion wrapped carefully in logic. "You'll gain perspective," she had said, "and perspective is becoming currency." So Callan came, lone, without expectations. He took a seat near the back, jacket folded neatly over his arm, eyes scanning the stage, while his mind lingered on emails unanswered. The panel discussion had already begun. Then Zanai Rivers spoke, not loudly, not dramatically. She spoke with clarity that carried beyond amplification. Her voice did not seek agreement, delivered insight. She was standing at a podium slightly too tall for her frame, one hand resting casually at its edge, the other gesturing occasionally, not for emphasis, but precision. She spoke about access gaps in entrepreneurship, about talent that stalled not because of lack of discipline, but because of limited entry points. She spoke plainly. Callan stopped checking his phone. She did not speak in abstractions. She spoke in outcomes. She named patterns without accusation. She challenged systems without dismissing individuals inside them. It was an approach Callan recognized intellectually, but had rarely seen executed so cleanly. He found himself leaning forward. Around him, the audience responded in layers. Some nodded immediately. Others shifted uncomfortably, processing. Zanai did not adjust her message to manage reactions. She stayed steady. Callan realized, with mild surprise, that he felt seen, not personally, but professionally. Her words intersected with problems his firm claimed to solve, yet she framed them through lived consequence rather than metrics. When the panel ended, applause filled the room. Zanai smiled briefly, thanked the moderator, and stepped away from the podium. Callan stood without thinking. He waited until a small group cleared, then approached her as she gathered her notes. Up close, she looked younger than he had expected, though her posture carried assurance that made age irrelevant. "That was thoughtful," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Callan." She took it. Her grip was firm, her eye contact direct, not evaluating. Present. "I appreciated how you framed access," he continued. "You didn't oversimplify it." She tilted her head slightly. "Oversimplification makes people comfortable. I'm not aiming for comfort." He smiled at that, genuinely. "Fair." They spoke briefly about the forum, about Houston's shifting business landscape, about the tension between innovation and inclusion. The conversation flowed without effort, not because they agreed on everything, but because neither felt the need to perform. When they parted, Callan expected the encounter to fade into the category of interesting but transient. Didn't. Their next conversation happened weeks later, over coffee. Callan had reached out under the pretext of continuing a discussion from the forum. Zanai accepted without hesitation, though she suggested a small cafe near her office rather than the downtown spots Callan frequented. The space was informal. Laptops shared tables with notebooks. Conversations overlapped easily. Zanai seemed at ease there. They talked for hours, not about romance, values, about ambition and cost, about how success changed people and how often it didn't. Zanai spoke openly about her work, about the women she mentored, about her belief that visibility was responsibility. Callan listened. He spoke about structure, about scalability, about the discipline required to sustain growth. He did not speak about his family at first. Zanai noticed, but did not press. Their meetings became regular. Walks after events, dinners that stretched longer than planned. They learned each other's rhythms. Zanai introduced Callan to spaces he had never occupied comfortably. Community meetings, informal gatherings where conversations skipped hierarchy and went straight to substance. He learned how much he did not know. Callan introduced Zanai to rooms where conversation was filtered, where tone mattered as much as content. She learned how coded language functioned as gatekeeping. They did not try to correct each other. They observed, asked questions, adjusted. Emotional intimacy grew gradually. It was not marked by grand declarations, but by consistency. Callan found himself wanting Zanai's opinion on decisions that mattered. Zanai found herself trusting Callan's steadiness. They laughed easily. They disagreed without threat. They shared quiet moments that felt unremarkable until reflected on later. For Callan, the relationship unsettled something deep. Zanai did not fit neatly into the frameworks he had inherited. She did not aspire to blend into his world. She existed fully in her own. That both attracted and unsettled him. For Zanai, Callan represented possibility and constraint simultaneously. She appreciated his curiosity, his willingness to listen. She noticed his hesitation when worlds collided. Neither named it yet. The pressure arrived gradually. Callan's parents asked questions framed as concern. His mother wondered aloud whether Zanai's work aligned with the family's long-term vision. His father, quieter, spoke about optics and sustainability. Introductions slowed. Invitations shifted. Zanai noticed dinners she was not invited to, conversations that paused when she entered rooms. Callan noticed, too. He reassured Zanai, but he did not challenge the structure directly. He believed time would ease resistance. Zanai believed clarity mattered more. Then Callan's father died. The loss was sudden, destabilizing. Callan retreated into work, into responsibility, into the habits that had always provided safety. He stopped talking about what he felt. He stopped asking for what he needed. Zanai needed presence. She needed honesty. She did not need fixing. She needed partnership. Callan could not access that space. Their conversations shortened. Silence filled gaps neither knew how to bridge. Zanai recognized the distance for what it was, not lack of care, but fear. The breakup was quiet. No accusations. No raised voices. Just an acknowledgement that something essential had been left unattended for too long. They parted with respect, but without resolution. Weeks later, Zanai discovered she was pregnant. The silence that followed would change everything. Zanai Rivers had always trusted her body. It had carried her through long nights of work, early mornings of preparation, seasons of exhaustion that demanded more than comfort could offer. She understood its rhythms well enough to notice when something shifted. At first, she dismissed it as stress. The breakup with Callan had been quiet, but heavy. The kind of ending that lingered, even when words stopped. Her schedule had not slowed. If anything, it had intensified. Meetings, mentoring sessions, travel, each day filled with responsibility that left little room for reflection. Still, something felt different. It was not dramatic. It was subtle. A delay, she noted mentally, then waved away. A fatigue that did not match her workload. A moment of stillness in the morning, where she found herself waiting for clarity instead of rushing toward tasks. When confirmation arrived, it came without ceremony. Zanai stood alone in her bathroom, the early light filtering through the window, holding the result with steady hands. Her heart did not race. Her breath did not hitch. She closed her eyes, allowing the reality to settle fully before reacting. Pregnant? The word did not frighten her. It grounded her. She sat on the edge of the tub for a long moment, hands resting loosely in her lap, and thought not of disruption, but of truth. This was not a crisis. It was information. Information that required care, intention, and honesty. Callan was the first person she thought of, not because she needed saving or reassurance, but because responsibility demanded acknowledgement. Whatever their ending had been, this was not something to carry silently. She reached for her phone. The message took time to write. Zanai did not rush it. She wanted clarity without accusation. She explained the timing. She acknowledged the silence between them. She made it clear that she was not asking for immediate answers, only presence. She read it twice. Her vulnerability was precise, measured, real. When she pressed send, she expected response. Not certainty, but acknowledgement. A signal that the door she was opening had not been locked permanently. The hours passed. Zanai went about her day, checking her phone without anxiety, trusting that space sometimes preceded conversation. By evening, she noticed the absence more clearly. No reply the following day. Still nothing. She checked again, assuming a delay, a missed notification, a full schedule. Callan had always been diligent. He would respond. Days passed. Zanai's trust in the situation shifted gradually, not into anger, but into awareness. Silence had weight, and this silence felt final in a way she had not anticipated. Unbeknownst to her, the message never reached him. A technical failure, unremarkable, easily explained later, had intercepted a moment that required no barrier. But in Zanai's world, intention mattered less than outcome. What she received was silence. She allowed herself one evening of grief, not loud, not performative, just honest. She sat in her living room, phone beside her, and accepted the possibility that she would not be met where she stood. That acceptance changed everything. Zanai did not wake up the next morning angry. She woke up resolved. If the silence meant something, she would not fill it with assumptions. She would respond with clarity. She decided early that bitterness would not shape her next steps. She had seen too many women carry resentment like a second burden. She chose differently. Zanai told her family first, not dramatically, not apologetically. She spoke plainly, trusting the foundation she had been raised on. The response was immediate and steady. Support did not arrive as questions. It arrived as logistics, as reassurance, as quiet certainty that she would not walk this path alone, even if she chose to raise her child independently. Zanai considered her options carefully. She weighed the reality of reopening a door that had already closed. She considered the emotional cost of chasing clarity from someone who had not responded. In the end, her decision was not framed as sacrifice. It was framed as responsibility. She chose to move forward without Callan's involvement, not because she believed he did not deserve to know, but because she believed her child deserved stability more than uncertainty. There was no bitterness in that choice. Intention. Zanai adjusted her life methodically. She restructured her schedule. She built systems that accounted for care, flexibility, and growth. She leaned into the same discipline that had built professional life. Motherhood did not erase her ambition. It refined it. She carried her pregnancy openly. She did not conceal it to maintain comfort in professional spaces. If a room was unsettled by her reality, she considered that a useful filter. Her work continued. Her influence grew. Her life expanded. When her son was born, Zanai felt no regret for the path she had chosen. She held him with the assurance of someone who had prepared not only materially, but emotionally. She named him with intention. She spoke to him with honesty. She built his world with the same values that had raised her: presence, accountability, and visibility. Callan Whitmore remained absent, not by design, but by circumstance left unchallenged. Zanai did not revisit the silence. She did not narrate herself as abandoned. She narrated herself as responsible. Years passed. Her son grew curious, observant, steady. He attended meetings. He listened to conversations. He learned early that he belonged everywhere his mother stood. Zanai never spoke ill of Callan. She spoke factually when asked. She did not hide the truth, but she did not lead with it either. She believed that truth arrived when it was needed, and when it finally did, on a stage, in a ballroom, under bright lights, she would meet it without hesitation. Zanai stood at the podium with both hands resting lightly on its edges, feeling the quiet attention of the room settle around her. She had spoken on larger stages than this one, louder ones, rooms filled with sharper skepticism, tighter resistance. This audience was receptive, composed of donors, executives, and leaders accustomed to affirming applause. Still, she approached the moment with the same discipline she always carried: measured, intentional, grounded. Her eyes moved across the room once more, not searching, not avoiding. She had already seen Callan. She had already registered his presence, the stillness in his posture, the tension beneath his calm exterior. She did not acknowledge it outwardly. Zanai began where she always did, with leadership. Leadership, she said, her voice steady and clear, is often described as vision, strategy, influence. But in practice, leadership is endurance. The room grew quiet in the way that signaled focus rather than politeness. It's the ability To keep showing up, she continued, even when the path changes, even when support looks different than expected, even when the cost becomes personal. Several heads nodded. Pens moved. Tension held. Zanai spoke about resilience, not as an abstract quality, but as a series of decisions made repeatedly. Decisions to continue building when momentum slowed. Decisions to remain visible when retreat felt safer. Decisions to stand firm when silence offered easier shelter. She referenced her work mentoring Black women entrepreneurs, describing patterns she had witnessed: talent overlooked, access delayed, credibility questioned until proven twice over. She spoke without anger, but without softening the truth. Resilience, she said, is not about enduring hardship quietly. It's about adapting without losing yourself. Callan listened, his chest tight, his focus sharpened beyond comfort. Each word carried familiarity, not because he had lived her experiences, but because he had observed their consequences without fully understanding them. Zanai shifted, her tone warming slightly. And leadership, she added, is also deeply human. The audience leaned in again. She spoke of responsibility beyond titles. Oh, decisions made with others in mind, of accountability that extended past quarterly goals. For me, she said calmly, that responsibility includes motherhood. The word landed gently, but firmly. She spoke of learning to prioritize with clarity, of understanding that time was finite and choices mattered. She spoke of strength that emerged not from control, but from care. Motherhood didn't limit my leadership, Zanai said. It clarified it. Her voice did not waver. She described mornings that began earlier than planned, evenings that ended later than expected. She spoke of patience, learned not from manuals, but from presence, of resilience shaped not by recognition, but by necessity. The room responded with warmth, soft laughter, knowing smiles, thoughtful silence. Zanai did not dramatize. She did not overshare. She wove her truth into the framework of her message, allowing it to inform rather than dominate. What she did not say mattered as much as what she did. She did not name absence. She did not narrate struggle as spectacle. She did not frame herself as exceptional. Instead, she spoke about continuity. How we lead, she said, is inseparable from how we live. The parts of ourselves we carry into rooms like this, one shape every decision we make, whether we acknowledge them or not. Her gaze passed briefly across the front row again. Callan felt it, even though she did not pause. Zanai concluded this portion of her speech by speaking about legacy, not as something inherited, but as something built through consistent presence. Legacy, she said, is not defined by what we accumulate. It's defined by what we take responsibility for. The applause that followed was sustained, thoughtful, earned. Zanai nodded once, appreciative but composed, and prepared to transition to her next point. She did not know, could not yet know, that the truth she had carried quietly for years had already taken shape in the mind of one man listening from the front row. Callan Whitmore had built his life on certainty. Certainty in preparation, certainty in process, certainty that if something mattered enough, it would announce itself clearly. What unfolded in that ballroom dismantled every one of those beliefs. As Zanai continued speaking, Callan felt recognition settle heavily in his chest, not as a memory, but as alignment. Her words about leadership, responsibility, and endurance threaded themselves through moments he had chosen not to examine closely. He replayed the past with uncomfortable clarity. The breakup that ended without resolution. The weeks that followed, filled with work and avoidance. The absence of closure he had mistaken for completion. His mind reached instinctively for denial. The child could not be his. The resemblance could be coincidence. Time could distort perception, but denial found no foothold. The image of the boy clinging to Zanai's leg returned with sharp precision. The shape of his eyes, the set of his mouth, the familiarity that had struck without warning. Callan's breath shortened again. His hands rested on his knees, fingers pressing into fabric, as if anchoring himself to the present. His heartbeat refused to slow. He became acutely aware of his body, of tension held too tightly, of control slipping through cracks he could no longer seal. Shock did not arrive loudly. It arrived as stillness. He sat frozen, while the room breathed around him. Regret followed quickly, but not as self-pity. It arrived as reckoning, a realization that his silence, unintended though it had been, had shaped a life beyond his awareness. He thought of Zanai standing on that stage, composed, respected, carrying her truth without announcement. He thought of the message she must have sent, the message he never saw, the space where response should have lived. The weight of that absence pressed against him. Callan's gaze drifted briefly toward Maribel. She was listening intently, proud, unaware of the fracture forming inches away from her. The future they had planned still existed, for now, untouched by the knowledge gathering in his chest. He looked back to the stage. Zanai spoke of accountability with ease, not knowing, or perhaps knowing without signaling, that her words were landing where they could not be ignored. Callan understood, with devastating clarity, that there was no version of this moment that allowed him to remain neutral. The child existed. The truth existed. Responsibility existed. No amount of composure could erase that. The applause rose again, and Callan joined it this time. Not out of courtesy, but out of respect, layered with disbelief. His palms met slowly, deliberately, each clap grounding him in the reality he could no longer deny. The life he thought he understood had expanded beyond his consent. And in that expansion, something else emerged. Not fear, but obligation. He not yet know how to respond. He did not know what the next hour would require, or how the night would end. But he knew whatever came next would demand honesty he had never practiced at this scale. The room glowed with admiration for the woman on stage. Callan Whitmore sat within it, quietly undone, his certainty replaced by a truth that refused containment. If this moment is hitting you already, drop a comment, because what comes next changes everything. The gala did not end abruptly. That was the first thing Callan noticed. There was no dramatic pause, no visible fracture in the evening's rhythm. Conversations resumed. Guests rose from their seats. Laughter returned in measured waves. The event continued exactly as it had been designed to. Smooth, controlled, impressive. Only Callan felt the difference. He waited, not because he was uncertain of what he needed to do, but because urgency would have drawn attention, and attention would have turned this into something Zanai had never asked for. He remained seated until the applause softened into movement, until Maribel was pulled into conversation by a donor, until the stage area cleared just enough to allow privacy without secrecy. Zanai stepped away from the podium, her notes gathered neatly, her posture unchanged. She spoke briefly with the host, exchanged a few words with attendees, accepted congratulations with polite gratitude. Callan watched her carefully. Nothing in her demeanor suggested surprise or avoidance. She moved through the room with the ease of someone accustomed to carrying weight without announcing it. When their eyes met again, this time without an audience, there was no hesitation. Zanai gave a small nod, not an invitation, an acknowledgement. Callan rose and followed her toward a quieter corridor just off the main ballroom, a space used for brief breaks and private conversations. The noise dimmed behind them, replaced by a muted hush. They stopped near a tall window overlooking the city lights. For a moment, neither spoke. Callan broke the silence first. "I didn't know," he said quietly. His voice was steady, not defensive, not pleading. The Nai turned toward him fully. Her expression was composed, attentive, open. "I figured you didn't," she replied. There was no edge in her tone, no accusation hiding beneath politeness. Callan swallowed. "I never received your message." She nodded once, as if filing the information rather than reacting to it. "I assumed as much, or at least, I hoped." Another pause. Callan searched her face for anger, for resentment, for anything that would explain the distance years had carved between them. He found none. "How old is he?" he asked. 5, Zanai said. "He turned 5 in the spring." The number settled heavily in his chest. "And you raised him alone," Callan continued, not as a question, but a recognition. "Yes, still no blame." Zanai spoke plainly, as she always had. She explained the timeline calmly. When she found out, when she reached out, how long she waited before understanding that the silence was not going to resolve itself. "I didn't chase," she said. "Not because I didn't care, but because I had to choose clarity over uncertainty." Callan nodded, slowly. "You did what you had to do." "Yes," she agreed. "I did." He exhaled, the weight of her words pressing against his ribs. "I should have been there." Zanai did not rush to reassure him. She did not soften the truth to make it easier to hear. "You weren't," she said. "That's simply what happened." Callan accepted that without protest. "I don't expect anything from you tonight. Zanai continued. I didn't bring this here to force a moment. I didn't plan for you to see him like that. I know, Callan said quickly. I know you wouldn't. Her gaze held his, steady and searching. Not for remorse, but for capacity. This conversation isn't about rewriting the past, Zanai said. It's about acknowledging it. Callan nodded again. Then let me acknowledge it clearly. He's my son. Zanai's expression softened slightly, not into relief, but into recognition. Yes, she said, he is. The truth settled between them, without spectacle. No raised voices, no demands, no bargaining, just fact. And for the first time, since the silence that had divided them, Callan felt the weight of something finally named. Callan did not speak. Immediately, he leaned one hand against the window, grounding himself, letting the city lights outside steady his thoughts. Fatherhood arrived not as a concept, but as a presence, immediate, undeniable. I don't have an excuse, he said finally. Zanai remained quiet, allowing space. I could say I was grieving. I could say I was overwhelmed. I could say a lot of things that explain why I went silent. He paused, but explanation isn't the same as responsibility. Zanai watched him closely now. Callan turned back toward her. His expression was stripped of its usual polish. Not frantic, but exposed. I missed years I can't get back, he said. That sits with me. Guilt surfaced, but it did not turn defensive. It did not search for absolution. It existed plainly, unadorned. Then I nodded once. That's true. Callan did not flinch. I'm not asking you to fix that for me, he continued. And I'm not asking to step into his life without care. I'm trying to understand what showing up looks like now. The question was not rhetorical. Zanai considered it carefully. Showing up, she said, starts with consistency, not declarations, not urgency, presence. Callan absorbed that. I can do that. I believe you want to, Zanai replied. Wanting isn't the same as doing. I understand, he said. Tell me what you need. Zanai exhaled slowly. I need honesty, she said, with yourself first, with the people around you, and eventually with him. Callan's mind moved immediately to Maribel, to the engagement waiting in the wings, to the life that had been constructed carefully around assumptions now proven incomplete. He did not mention it yet. I don't intend to disrupt the life you've built, Zanai added. My son's stability matters more to me than vindication. That won't be disrupted, Callan said. Not by me. Zanai studied him for a moment, assessing not his words, but the discipline behind them. This isn't about tonight, she said. It's about what happens after. Callan nodded. Then let me be clear about that too. I won't pretend this didn't happen. I won't compartmentalize it. Zanai's gaze softened, not into forgiveness, but into cautious acknowledgement. That's all I ask, she said. They stood there for a moment longer. Two people facing a truth that had reshaped both their lives in different ways. Inside the ballroom, laughter rose again. Music played softly. The evening continued. Outside that noise, something quieter took shape. Responsibility. Callan Whitmore did not leave that corridor absolved. He left it changed. The knowledge that he was a father settled into him fully, not as a title, but as an obligation he would now have to live up to. And Zanai Rivers, steady as ever, walked back into the room, knowing she had done what she had always done, spoken truth without asking permission. Callan Whitmore did not return to the ballroom unchanged. He moved through the remaining moments of the gala with practiced composure, thanking donors, acknowledging compliments, standing beside Maribel when required. To anyone watching, he was the same man he had been at the start of the evening, attentive, controlled, appropriate. Inside, everything had shifted. The conversation in the corridor replayed in fragments. Zanai's calm voice, the certainty in her words, the fact that fatherhood had arrived not through planning, but through consequence. The truth existed now, fully formed, and it demanded response. Callan understood something with clarity that surprised him. There was no middle path. He could not protect every version of his life simultaneously. Something would be sacrificed, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. The question was not whether there would be loss. The question was where it would fall. Engagement versus responsibility. Image versus integrity. He had spent years believing these things could be aligned through patience and restraint. Tonight proved that alignment required decision. When the gala ended, Callan and Maribel rode home together in silence, broken only by polite conversation. Maribel spoke of the evening's success, of donor responses, of follow-up meetings already forming in her mind. Callan listened, responding when expected, his mind elsewhere. At home, he stood alone for a long time after Maribel went to bed. He thought of the life he had built carefully, one that fit expectations, that earned approval, that required little emotional risk. He thought of the life he had unknowingly created alongside it, a child growing, learning, watching. The contrast was not dramatic. It was stark. Callan realized that his engagement had been shaped by compatibility and presentation, not by full truth. That did not make it false, but it made it incomplete. Responsibility, on the other hand, was now absolute. There was no scenario in which he could acknowledge his son privately while preserving his public life unchanged. Silence was no longer an option. Compartmentalization was no longer ethical. Integrity demanded coherence. The realization did not bring relief. It brought resolve. Callan knew what choice he would make before he slept, and he knew the cost would be real. Callan spoke to Maribel the following morning, not hurriedly, not impulsively. He waited until there was space, quiet, uninterrupted, honest. They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight filtering in, the ordinary setting at odds with what he needed to say. Maribel noticed his seriousness immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked. Callan did not delay. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "I need to tell it fully." She listened without interruption as he explained the past, his relationship with Zenai, the timing, the silence, the child. He did not dramatize. He did not excuse. He took responsibility for what he had not known, and for what he now understood. Maribel remained still. When he finished, she did not respond right away. "You're saying," she said carefully, "that you have a son." "Yes, that you didn't know until last night." "That's true." She nodded slowly, absorbing the information not as betrayal, but as revelation. "And now?" she asked. Callan met her gaze. "Now I can't move forward with this engagement." The words landed quietly. Maribel's expression shifted, not into anger, but into something closer to recognition. She had always sensed that something essential was missing between them. This truth did not create the distance. It named it. "I appreciate you telling me," she said after a moment, "and I appreciate that you're not pretending this can be managed without consequence." "I won't," Callan said. "That wouldn't be fair to you or to him." Maribel exhaled slowly. "This changes everything." "Yes." She stood, pacing once, then stopped. "You're choosing responsibility." And integrity," she added, "even though it costs you." "Yes." Maribel nodded again. Her composure held, though her disappointment was clear. "Then ending this is the right thing." There were no raised voices, no accusations, no attempt to salvage something that could not be rebuilt honestly. They agreed to speak with their families together. They accepted the social consequences that would follow: questions, speculation, discomfort. Callan did not resist them. When the engagement ended, it did so without spectacle. No public announcement, no blame assigned. Just truth delivered consistently. Callan Whitmore stepped into a future that would require more of him than he had ever offered before. Not as a gesture, as a commitment. Callan Whitmore did not arrive with expectations. That was the first difference Zenai noticed. When he asked to see his son again, it was not framed as a demand or a correction of the past. It was phrased carefully, respectfully, an acknowledgement that access was something he would need to earn, not assume. "I'd like to spend time with him," Callan said during a brief phone call days after the engagement ended. "At your pace, on your terms." Zenai listened. She had learned to hear what people wanted beneath what they said. What she heard now was restraint, not performance, but awareness. "Start slow," she replied. "He doesn't know you. I understand." Their first meeting happened in a public park, late afternoon, neutral ground. Zenai arrived early with her son, letting him run ahead toward the playground while she watched closely. Callan arrived alone. No gifts, no gestures meant to impress, just presence. He stayed at a distance at first, sitting on a bench while Zanai and her son played. He did not interrupt. He did not insert himself into moments that were not his yet. When Zanai's son noticed him, she introduced Callan simply. "This is Callan." No title, no explanation. The boy studied him briefly, curious but unconcerned, then returned to his game. Callan let out a quiet breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Learning to parent began there, not with instruction, but with observation. Callan watched how Zanai spoke to her son. Clear, patient, firm, without being harsh. He noticed routines she had established, boundaries that created safety. He asked questions later, not in front of the child. What does he like to eat? What helps him calm down when he's tired? What should I avoid doing? He did not assume. He knew the answers. Listening became his first discipline. Over time, he began joining them more actively, pushing swings, sitting on the ground during snack breaks, reading stories when invited. He followed Zanai's lead without resentment, understanding that her authority in their son's life was earned through years of consistency. There were mistakes. Callan spoke too formally sometimes, correcting when encouragement would have served better. He hesitated when decisiveness was needed. He overthought moments that required simplicity. Zanai corrected him calmly. That's not necessary. Let him finish. He needs reassurance right now. Callan adjusted without defensiveness. Consistency followed. He showed up when he said he would. He stayed present even when work pulled at him. He restructured his schedule, not as a favor, but as a priority shift. Fatherhood, he learned, was not about claiming space. It was about holding it. Weeks turned into months. Zani's son began to recognize Callan as familiar. Trust did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated quietly, through repeated presence, through moments of laughter, through the absence of disappointment. Callan did not rush it, and Zanai noticed. Zanai never interpreted Callan's return as a romantic overture. That distinction mattered. Their conversations centered on logistics first: school schedules, meals, transitions. Co-parenting was the foundation. Everything else, if it arrived, would come later. Callan respected that boundary. He did not reminisce unnecessarily. He did not frame the present as a second chance. He focused on competence and reliability. Zanai observed him closely. Trust for her was not about words. It was about pattern. She watched how Callan spoke to their son when frustrated, how he handled correction, how he responded when plans changed unexpectedly. She watched how he spoke about responsibility, not as burden, but as alignment. Gradually, something shifted. Not romance. Safety. Zanai found herself less guarded in conversation. She spoke more openly about her work, her fatigue, her goals. Callan listened without interrupting, without offering solutions unless asked. They laughed occasionally, naturally, unexpectedly. Shared moments surfaced not from nostalgia, but from familiarity. One evening, after their son had fallen asleep, they sat on opposite ends of the couch, discussing the next school year. "This feels stable," Callan said quietly. Zanai nodded. "That's intentional." He met her gaze. "Don't want to rush anything." "Good," she replied. "Neither do I." Growth followed at its own pace. Zanai acknowledged the changes she saw in Callan, not aloud, not as praise, but as allowance. She let him take on more responsibility. She trusted him with decisions that mattered. Callan carried that trust carefully. Romance, when it began to surface, did so subtly, through glances held longer than necessary, through concern that extended beyond logistics, through emotional presence that no longer felt tentative. But neither named it. They understood that rebuilding something meaningful required patience, that the foundation they were laying was not for appearances, but for longevity. Their son noticed the shift before either of them did. He began seeking Callan out more often, asking questions, sharing stories. Zanai watched those moments with quiet awareness. Whatever emerged between her and Callan would have to support this, not complicate it. And for the first time, she believed that might be possible. What Callan and Zanai built together the second time did not look like a story people applauded from the outside. There were no grand gestures meant to impress, no declarations timed for maximum effect, no attempt to rewrite what had already happened. Instead, there was repair, and repair, they learned, was quieter than romance. Healing did not come from pretending the past had never existed. It came from acknowledging it without letting it dictate every decision. Callan never asked Zanai to forget the years she had carried responsibility alone. Zanai never used those years as leverage. They allowed the past to sit where it belonged, behind them, visible, instructive. Some days were easy. Others required patience neither had anticipated. There were moments when old patterns threatened to resurface, Callan's instinct to retreat into structure, Zanai's instinct to carry weight without asking for support. They named those moments when they happened. "That's you pulling away," Zanai would say calmly. "And that's me assuming I have to handle it alone," Callan would respond. They learned each other again, not as they had been, but as they were now. Family, too, took on a new meaning. It was no longer defined by last names, engagements, or carefully curated futures. It was defined by presence, by who showed up consistently, by who adjusted when necessary. Their son became the center, not because he demanded it, but because responsibility required it. Decisions were filtered through what would keep him secure, not sheltered from truth, but anchored in stability. Callan learned that being a father did not mean replacing what had been missing. It meant building something new without ego. Zanai learned that accepting partnership did not mean surrendering independence. It meant allowing someone else to carry weight alongside her. Love, when it emerged fully between them, did so without spectacle. It showed up in shared routines, in quiet evenings, in the way Callan listened when Zanai spoke about her work, and the way Zanai trusted Callan to handle moments that mattered. They did not rush to label it. They did not need to. This was not a fairy tale. It was better, because it was real. In the end, this story was never about a gala, or a revelation, or even a second chance at romance. It was about choice. Callan Whitmore learned that power without presence is empty. Titles, influence, and reputation mean little if responsibility is avoided when it matters most. Real leadership begins where convenience ends. Zanai Rivers showed that silence is not safety. Truth, spoken with clarity and calm, creates space for accountability, even when it arrives later than expected. And together, they discovered something deeper. Love does not survive by avoiding truth. Love survives because of it. Not the kind of truth that humiliates or accuses, but the kind that names reality and asks for growth. The final image is not dramatic, is ordinary. A family seated together at a small table, a child speaking excitedly about his day, two adults listening, fully present, no longer distracted by who they were supposed to be. That is where the story ends, not in perfection, but in alignment. If this story moved you, like the video, share it with someone who believes love can grow from truth, and subscribe for more American love stories.